Caleb Morgan came back to his hometown after years at war, just hoping to find a little peace, a place where he could slow his breathing and hear the wind slide through the same woods he grew up with. He pictured quiet nights, the moon slipping through the cracks of an old window, leaves falling steady like a clock that never rushed. But that first night, the picture shattered. A scream tore across the timber line, sharp enough to cut his chest in two, and a cold sweat broke down his back. Before he had time to think, Caleb was already moving through the dark, and that's when he found her, a little girl he had never seen before, eyes wide with terror, clutching hard to his shoulders. Her voice trembled as she whispered just 3 words. "Barn number 12. Mom. Who brought her here? Who was out there in the woods, hiding where the trees swallowed the light? And why was the whole town so quiet, like none of it had ever happened?" Caleb had survived mortar shells, ambushes, the kind of days where death sat in your lap and wouldn't leave. But this wasn't shrapnel or rifles. It was something heavier, a kind of silence that pressed on his chest, a mystery thick enough to make him wonder if he had ever really come home at all. The old pickup stopped in front of the weathered porch. The engine died out, leaving only the wind rushing along the slope. Caleb opened the door, his boot landing on the dry gravel, crunching rough like the throat of a man who hadn't spoken in days. He stood there for a moment, staring at the house. No one came out to greet him, no shape behind the window. Just a house sitting still, like some tired old animal, shingles gray and moss-stained, gutters bent, the porch steps sagging in the same spot where someone once waited for him to come home. He walked slow, hand gripping the strap of his bag. "This is my house," he reminded himself, but it felt like he was standing on the edge of someplace strange. His palm pressed against the doorknob, cold as metal left too long in the rain. The latch scraped the frame, a sound that once meant supper on the table, now sounding like a half-hearted hello. The door swung open, and damp air rushed out. Dust hung in a strip of weak sunlight, tiny specks drifting like little boats with no one steering them. He set his canvas bag down by the doorway, left the lights off. Back here, the dark carried a different scent, wood, cloth, a life folded away. He moved past the kitchen. The sink was dry, dishes stacked upside down like a line of small hills. On the table, a chipped mug carried a dark stain, the kind you get from being held too long and left unfinished. His finger brushed it, lifted it, felt the weight of it like a late greeting. On the cupboard, a yellowed scrap of paper still clung on. Flour, coffee, 3-inch nails. Years gone, but the paper hadn't let go, though the writing was close to fading. In the living room, the sofa sagged where someone once Saturday. On the wall, a lone nail stayed behind. The picture it held long gone, along with the faces that belonged to this place. Caleb stood staring for a while, then let out a breath. His hand slipped to the chest pocket, where he kept small things gathered along the way. A pencil stub, a rusted pin, a coin. Nothing useful, but throwing them out always left a hole. He opened the back door. The wind carried in the smell of dry leaves, wet dirt, the pine woods behind the house. The old oaks still stood. As a boy, he'd stuck posts in the ground to mark his height at the edge of the trees. The posts were gone, but the grass still held low marks, faint as ink washed thin. The swing under the oak was still there, rope-worn, wooden seat tilted. Each breeze made it creak like a sigh. Caleb touched the seat, cold. And just like that, memory rushed back, small legs kicking, clear laughter breaking into sunlight. He closed his eyes and let the memory find its own way home. When the sky dimmed, Caleb turned on the light. A pale glow spread, not enough to chase away the shadows, but enough to make the house feel less foreign. He opened his bag, pulled out a few shirts, a folding knife, a coil of rope, a tin box filled with letters never sent. His hand lingered on the box, then set it down. Some things you wrote, just to stay alive. No one ever needed to read them. Dinner was plain. Canned beans, a slice of bread, a bottle of water. He ate slow, learning again how to share time with himself. Out there, the world taught you to swallow fast. Now each bite was a way of putting the day back in order. When he finished, he washed the cup, dried it, set it back where it belonged, a small ritual to keep the shape of home alive. Night settled. The house breathed in the dark. Caleb lay on a bed, both familiar and strange, eyes on the ceiling. Silence here wasn't like silence in war. Out there, silence meant waiting for the blast. Here, silence was a deep pond. You sat long enough, and you'd hear the stones drop to the bottom. He hadn't drifted off when the wind shifted. Damp air from the woods slid in through the window. Trees rubbed against each other, whispering like voices. Then it came a scream cutting through the valley. High, sharp, then gone. Caleb opened his eyes, didn't move right away. He waited, listening, and it came again, fainter, distant, but real. He sat up, feet on the cold floorboards. The soldier's instinct stirred. He stepped out onto the porch, hand closing on the old aluminum flashlight. He didn't turn it on, just held it tight. The wind slapped his face, carrying dirt, leaves, the taste of night. Caleb stood still, ears searching. The darkness was thick, but somewhere out there, a sound had called up a past he thought he'd buried. He knew he would have to walk out, find whether that sound was flesh and blood or just ghosts of memory. But for now, he stood there and let his heart pound, let his breath run steady, let the night cover him like if he stood long enough, the house might remember him, and maybe he could start to believe he'd really come home. Morning broke with a pale kind of light, thin as mist, slipping through the cracks of the old windows and leaving long stripes across the faded wood floor. Caleb sat up, feet hitting the cold boards, the smell of night still hanging in the air. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled in a deep breath, his lungs sounding like wind pushing through the trees. The grass out front was heavy with dew, each drop catching the tilt of the sun as it climbed over the ridge. He stood there a long while, like he was waiting for something to give itself away in what should have been an ordinary morning. But it wasn't ordinary. At the edge of the yard, where the narrow path cut into the woods, the earth was darker, pressed in with prints that weren't his. Caleb walked closer, slow. There in the damp dirt were small footprints, shallow but clear, muddy, and leading straight into the shadows of the trees. He crouched down, laid his hand against the ground, still holding the cool damp of the night. The size of the prints too small for a grown man, not the kind of boots hunters wore. The steps sat close together, uneven in places, like whoever made them was rushing or about to give out. His pulse kicked hard, somewhere between curiosity and caution, as his eyes traced the path those prints had taken. Above, a flick of pale color caught his eye on a low oak branch. He looked up, a child's scarf, faded pink, frayed at the edges, snagged between two limbs. The wind tugged it just enough to make it flutter, like a small hand waving in silence. Caleb reached up, pulled it free. The cloth was cold, smelled faintly of dirt and sweat. He held it tight, and something inside him pinched. Years away had taught him to keep his heart clear of things he couldn't control. But right then, he felt a pull, like some invisible line tied him to whoever had left these scraps behind. He stood still, scarf in hand, staring into the timber. Deeper in, the morning light couldn't touch, leaving nothing but dark, cross-hatched lines. The wind cut through the leaves, but underneath it was a strange hush. The songbirds, usually calling at first light, were gone quiet. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. Caleb took one step, then stopped, his heartbeat thudding heavy in his chest. He turned back to the porch, set the scarf down on the rail, telling himself he'd grab his boots and a heavy coat before pushing further. But his feet wouldn't move. His eyes locked on that narrow strip of dirt leading inward. Those small prints clung to his mind. Maybe it was nothing a neighbor's kid playing around, left a scarf behind. But the scream from last night rang in his ears, and coincidence started feeling more like a splinter under skin. Caleb shrugged on his coat and stepped back out. The sun climbed higher, light spreading wide, but it didn't clear the shadows crowding his thoughts. He followed the prints, each step careful, the way you move when memory reminds you that footprints can be bait. This wasn't some far-off land, though. This was home, a place meant for rest, that made the unease even sharper. The trail wound deeper, skirting tree trunks and pushing past tall grass. Sometimes the prints vanished under the leaf litter, then showed up again. At one spot, a long scuff marked the ground, like small feet had slipped, gone down, then pushed back up. Caleb froze, chest tightening, picturing a child's body tumbling in the cold dirt, small hands scraping for hold. He shivered, picked up a snapped branch, gripped it tight like it might steady him. A faint rustle carried from ahead, sharp enough to lift his head. He held his breath, listening. Just the wind, but he knew better. That kind of silence wasn't natural. It was the kind he'd known before when someone was there, hiding, waiting to see if you'd press on or turn back. Caleb tightened his grip on the branch, stepped forward again, the pressure in his chest building. He bent low, spotted a fresh leaf with a thin scratch across it, like from a fingernail. On the tree bark nearby, a scrape stood out, bright against the old surface. Small details, easy to miss, but together they painted a picture you couldn't ignore. He stopped, lifted his head, stared down the line of trees forming a long corridor into the dark. The world seemed to narrow, pulling him onto one path. His breathing shortened, air pressing tight in his chest. Then it came the sound of leaves shifting. Not the quick scatter of wind, but longer, heavier, like someone moving, trying to be quiet, but not quite pulling it off. Caleb turned, eyes cutting sharp, his hand squeezing the branch till his knuckles strained. His heart slammed deep against his ribs. Someone was out there, watching him. Caleb froze where the leaves had just stirred, his eyes sweeping across the tree trunks lined up like silent pillars. The woods were thick with shadow, but he noticed a low dip in the ground, covered in dead leaves, the color darker than the rest. He moved toward it slowly, boots pressing into the damp soil, each step giving off a brittle crackle, and there, at the base of a wide oak, he saw a small figure curled up, shaking like a bird knocked from its nest. A little girl, clothes dirty, arms wrapped tight around her knees, hair matted, her face pale from cold and fear. Her eyes were wide, locked on him, startled the way a stray sees a stranger. Caleb stood still, a sharp ache tightening his chest. The sight hit something inside he hadn't let himself feel in years, the fragility he once saw overseas, where children were always too small against the weight of the world. He bent down slow, one knee to the dirt, his hands stretching out but not rushing, letting his breath move easy so he wouldn't scare her further. The girl's eyes stayed wary, but under the trembling there was a faint flicker of hope, like her gut told her this man wasn't here to hurt her. Caleb pressed his palm against the tree trunk beside him, then lowered it flat to the ground, letting her see he carried nothing but his own presence. He remembered those long years when children in war zones would step closer if all you gave them was a kind look. This moment felt the same. No words needed, just silence offered as a kind of shelter. A breeze rolled through, carrying the scent of wet leaves and soil. The girl flinched, coughed once, her body trembling harder. Caleb inched forward, raising his hand again, open palm up, a bridge as thin as trust. She stared at it, her eyes darting. Then finally, a small hand, dirty, shaking, slipped out and touched his. Her fingers felt so fragile it was as if they might vanish if not held. Caleb gave a slow nod, then eased her out from under the oak. She was light as air, and when he pulled her close, his instincts took over, protective, the same as when he used to shield a brother under fire. He lifted her into his arms, her small frame pressing into his chest, her uneven breath soaking into the coarse fabric of his coat. Part of him eased, knowing he had reached her in time. But another part of him tensed harder, because every sign around told him this wasn't just a lost child. Caleb turned, steadying his steps toward the open grass and morning light beyond the trees. Each footfall was careful, keeping the noise down, the feeling in his gut telling him the forest itself was listening. He was only a few dozen paces from the edge when a sound cracked behind him, something heavy pressing into the leaves, not rushed, but deliberate. Caleb stopped cold, his heart hammering against his ribs. The girl stiffened, clutching his neck, her breath caught tight. He tilted his head, ears straining. Not wind, not an animal. Footsteps, heavy, even, each one pressed with a calm that carried menace. Caleb drew a slow breath, eyes cutting the dark, his body tightening by instinct, the soldier in him waking. His hand rested on the girl's back, a steadying weight meant to quiet her fear. Then he turned, slow and measured. Between the trunks, the shadows stacked thick. But there, not far off, a shape began to emerge. Broad, moving with patience, blocking the narrow shaft of light spilling through. Caleb held his ground, the girl clinging to him, every sense braced as he waited for that figure to step fully out of the trees. Caleb pushed the wooden door open, and the frame let out that long, familiar squeak. Only this time, it wasn't just the sound of an old house groaning. It was more like a sigh, like a place that had gone too long without the warmth of living voices. He stepped inside with the girl still tight in his arms. She was trembling, her small frame worn down by fear and exhaustion. The morning sun was high now, cutting sideways through the thin curtain and laying pale streaks across the dust that floated in the air. For years, the house had been nothing but stillness, but now, with her presence in it, the air seemed heavier, denser, yet strangely alive. Caleb lowered her onto the worn-out sofa in the living room, its fabric faded and torn in places, but softer than the cold ground she had been curled up on. From an old trunk, he pulled a wool blanket and laid it gently over her, his movements slow, careful, as though even the sound of cloth settling might stir the fear that still clung to her eyes. The girl, he would later learn her name was Emily, curled herself tight inside that blanket. Her small hand gripped the edge of the fabric, her eyes half shut, but not quite surrendered to sleep. Caleb sat on the chair across from her, leaning forward, his hands knotted together, watching her with a mix of sadness and confusion. He had no idea where she'd come from, or why she'd been left wandering in those woods, but he felt the truth of her loneliness, as if fate itself had bound them together in that one moment. This house, which for so long had been filled only with the sound of wind and his own footsteps, now carried the uneven rhythm of a child's breathing, the soft whimper that escaped now and then, and in his chest, a fragile kind of peace took root, the kind that comes when someone else's survival depends on you. He stood, moved into the kitchen, filled the one unchipped mug with water, and brought it back to her. Emily took it with shaky hands, sipping small, careful gulps, her eyes never lifting from the blanket. When she set the mug back on the table, her lips moved, her voice no more than a thread of air. Barn, truck, light, then silence again. Caleb's brow furrowed, his chest tightening. The words were scattered, incomplete, but they pointed to something darker than just a child lost in the woods. He didn't press her. A man who's seen fear knows not to push it. He sat still, letting the room hold the quiet, letting her feel safe enough to rest. Time slipped by slow. Outside, the sunlight thickened on the porch, but inside the house the air stayed dim and soft. Caleb added wood to the stove, coaxing a weak flame into something steady. The smell of burning oak spread through the room, mixing with the damp scent of the old house and the wool blanket wrapped around her. Emily's eyes fluttered shut, her small body twitching now and then, but finally sleep took her. Caleb sat back, his eyes fixed on the shifting fire. Part of him wanted to believe he had gotten her out of danger. Another part, deeper and sharper, told him this wasn't finished, not with the scream he'd heard in the woods, not with the fragments she had whispered. Midday came and went in quiet. Caleb took the time to walk the house, locking windows, bracing the back door with boards, the kind of habits he'd carried back from years of guarding himself against the unknown. Every motion was slow but deliberate, making sure nothing could be forced open too easily. From the window, he looked out toward the tree line, where the forest stood too still under the Sunday. He couldn't shake the shadow he'd glimpsed the night before. A soldier's instinct doesn't retire, and his told him that whatever had started was far from done. When he returned to the living room, Emily was still asleep. Her lips moved faintly, as though speaking inside a dream. Caleb pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders and sat back down. He let himself drift, just for a moment, into a shallow rest. When he opened his eyes again, the light of afternoon had turned golden and long across the floorboards. Emily was awake now. Her gaze still held fear, but it had shifted. There was something else there too, a thin line of trust. When he handed her a piece of dry bread, her small fingers closed around his hand and didn't let go right away. He didn't ask questions, didn't push words at her. He sat close, letting his presence say enough. As evening fell, the house sank back into its heavy stillness. Caleb coaxed another fire into life, the flames shaking and throwing thin yellow light against the wooden walls. Emily sat on the sofa, the blanket around her shoulders, staring into the fire's dance. Every so often she would speak a few broken fragments, lights, iron door, voices. Each word struck Caleb like a needle. He didn't jot them down, didn't treat them as evidence yet, but together they formed a picture he couldn't look away from. His gut tightened, the unease seeping back in, filling his breaths. Night lowered itself slow and heavy. Caleb decided Emily would stay in the living room, close to the fire, where he could keep watch. He laid out his own blanket beside the stove, close enough to reach her if she startled awake. Before settling down, he checked the flashlight, setting it within reach beside his old folding knife. Years had made him cautious, and caution had kept him alive. He stretched out, listening the insects outside, the wood popping in the flames, Emily's soft breathing. Those small sounds felt like a fragile rhythm he wanted to protect. But as the hours slid by, the wind outside the woods shifted, pressing harder, rattling the leaves so they whispered like a chorus of unseen voices. Caleb sat up, listening. Nothing but wind. He lay back again, though his eyes never fully closed. Inside him, unease burned slow, like an ember refusing to go out. Time dragged heavy. Near midnight, just as sleep began to pull him under, a new sound pushed through the night. It was thicker, steadier, the low rumble of an engine. At first far off, then closer, clearer with each second. Caleb's eyes snapped open, his chest thudding. He sat up, heart pounding, and Emily woke too, jolting upright, her eyes wide, fear spilling across her face. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a signal for silence. The engine slowed, the growl deepening, tires crunching across the gravel outside. Then it stopped right in front of the porch. Mornings in the woods start with a silence deeper than anywhere else. No car engines, no voices, just the breath of trees, a few scattered bird calls, and the damp smell of earth rising after a cold night. Caleb stood on the porch, his eyes on the tree line. The faint marks of tire tracks were still pressed into the gravel from the night before, and seeing them made his chest heavy. Whoever had pulled up out there was gone now. They'd come, they'd stopped, they'd stood just beyond his porch, and then they'd left. No note, no sign, just silence that weighed more than words. He looked back inside. Emily was still curled up under the thick blanket, her breath short, her brows pulled tight as if even her dreams weren't safe. Caleb stepped to her side, pulled the edge of the blanket up over her shoulder, then slipped his coat on without a sound. He knew he couldn't just sit and wait. Last night had proved the house was no longer the safe shell he wanted it to be. If he meant to protect the girl, he had to find out what the woods were hiding. The dirt road into the trees was soft, damp with morning dew. Caleb moved slow, his boots sinking with each step, the sound hardly more than a murmur. Years of soldiering had drilled one lesson deep. Silence is your ally when you don't know what's out there. His ears pulled in every shift of air, his eyes swept the light and shadow between the trunks. It didn't take long to find the first sign. Beneath the scatter of leaves were deep impressions, not the light prints of a child like before. These were larger, spaced wide, pressed down hard the stride of a grown man. Caleb crouched, set his palm flat against the earth, still damp, the edges sharp. Whoever had walked here hadn't done it long ago. The thought of them nearby put his nerves on a tighter wire. He moved deeper. Sunlight dropped through the canopy in thin strips, gold lines cutting across the dark. In a small clearing, he saw beer cans scattered. Some rusted, their tops jagged, others still bright, the metal catching the light. He picked one up, turned it in his hand. The rim was damp, the scent still sharp. Whoever had sat here had been here not long ago. He let it fall, his eyes cutting across the ground. This wasn't random. This spot had been used over and over again. A meeting place, a rest stop, not an accident. His heart beat harder. Each clue began tying into the next. Emily lost in the woods, the scream in the night, the overlapping footprints, and now these cans, these cigarette burns in the dirt. Somebody used this place regularly. More than one somebody. Caleb pressed on. The deeper he went, the heavier the trees closed in. Birds thinned out, then went quiet altogether. The only sound was his own boots, muffled under the tall trunks. At the base of a maple, he stopped. Half buried in the leaves lay a small wooden box, square, tilted. He bent down and picked it up. The size fit in one hand, lid scratched, the wood worn, but on it were markings, carved deep. He brushed away dirt and read the two letters cut into the grain, VC. Just two letters, but they chilled his spine. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a mark, a signature. Someone had left this to say, "This belongs to us." Caleb pried the lid open. Inside was nothing, just dry leaf crumbs, but the emptiness made it worse. A box like this wasn't built to be left behind. It had carried something once, and now it was gone. Taken or cleared out. Either way, the message was loud. He slid the box inside his coat, then stepped back, eyes sweeping the woods. Behind him on a nearby trunk were cuts in the bark. Fresh enough the wood inside still shone pale. Another signal. Someone had stood here, marking ground for others. Men don't carve messages into trees for nothing. Caleb shut his eyes for a breath, then opened them. The forest wasn't wild space anymore. It was a grid, a system, a place with purpose, built by men who knew exactly what they were doing. He pulled in a long breath, forcing it slow. His resolve hardened. If he didn't follow this trail to its end, he'd never know what had dragged Emily into its shadows. Still, a thought gnawed at him. This wasn't chance. This had been in motion long before last night, maybe months, maybe years, right under the nose of a small town that never spoke of it. The weight of that idea sat like stone in his chest. Step by step, he moved forward. Each pace measured, each pause deliberate. More cans now, tucked under brush, more footprints pressed heavy into wet dirt, all following one direction as though to a familiar spot. Caleb crouched, pressed his palm to one print, the cold earth biting into his skin. His mind lined the pieces together. Men gathering, leaving trash, carving marks, using boxes. Not once, but again and again. The forest wasn't empty, it was occupied. He straightened, his gaze cutting far ahead. The light dimmed as clouds pulled across the sun, throwing the woods into shadow. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the silence of nature, but the kind that comes when something is waiting. Caleb's skin prickled. He turned slow, his hand closing around the knife in his pocket, his body shifting into the stance he knew too well. He heard nothing, saw nothing, but the weight on his back told him eyes were there, watching. The quiet pressed harder, thick enough to hear his own heartbeat thud like a drum. Then, without warning, it cracked apart. From deep in the woods came a blast, sharp, hard, echoing. The sound ripped through the trees, the ground trembling under his boots. The tension of the morning erupted into violence. A flock of birds tore into the sky, wings thrashing, light flashing through them as they scattered like a storm of ash. Caleb froze, eyes wide, breath caught at his throat, every muscle drawn tight. The echo of the blast rolled on, bouncing through the forest, winding into his bones. And in that moment, he knew. He had crossed a line. He wasn't just walking through the woods of his childhood anymore. He had stepped straight into the heart of something dangerous. That morning's silence hadn't been peace. It had been a warning, one he could no longer ignore. Caleb pulled himself out of the stretch of woods, where the blast had rattled the ground, his steps heavy but deliberate, his eyes never leaving, the marks pressed into the soil. He knew better than to linger. Stay too long, and the shadows would close in. His gut told him to reach the dirt road before anyone else showed up. But as he neared the tree line, there was already someone waiting. A man leaned against the side of a moss-green pickup. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rough beard grown more for show than for comfort. His eyes were narrowed, hard with suspicion, watching Caleb like he was measuring every breath. Caleb didn't need an introduction. He knew this was Victor Clay, the man who ran the hunting camp north of town. A name that always seemed to drift into barroom stories, and never in a good way. Victor lit a cigarette, smoke curling white at the corner of his mouth. He gave a crooked smile, but it was the kind that hid more than it offered, covering the scrutiny burning in his gaze. Caleb stopped a few paces away, still as stone, watching back. The space between them filled thick with tension, heavy enough that the fall of a leaf might have been mistaken for the pounding of a heart. Caleb didn't speak first. He let silence do the work, a shield that forced the other man to break it. "You've wandered a little far from your porch, Morgan," Victor said, his voice low, gravel, rough. "These woods aren't a place just anyone should be poking around." Caleb stood firm, his arms loose at his sides, eyes steady on the man across from him. The warning in Victor's words was plain, wrapped in mockery, like he thought he had the authority to decide who belonged where. Caleb pulled a slow breath, his reply measured. "I was just walking. Still looks like public land to me." "Way?" Victor shrugged, blew out smoke, and let a short laugh rumble in his throat. "Public land, sure, but there are unwritten rules out here. Maybe you've forgotten them since you've been gone." His eyes cut downward, toward Caleb's coat, where the edge of the wooden box showed. "Picked up something, didn't you?" Caleb shifted slightly, turning his body to block the sight. He didn't answer right away, their eyes locked, a quiet test of wills, neither giving ground. At last Caleb let his voice fall even. "Just trash, nothing worth keeping." Victor ground the cigarette into the dirt under his boot, his stare never leaving Caleb's face. "Word of advice. Don't get curious. You've got a kid in that house, don't you? Keep her quiet. Keep her inside those four walls. Some things aren't meant for outsiders to nose into." The words weren't loud, but they landed heavy, like a stone dropped in still water. Caleb's chest tightened. He wanted to step closer, to push him for every detail buried in that threat, but instinct held him back. Men like Victor didn't live on straight talk. They moved in networks, shadows, favors traded in back rooms. Pressing him here would only draw danger closer to Emily. He filled his lungs, steadying himself, then let out a short answer. "I'll take care of my own house." With that, he turned, starting down the road. Victor smirked, the sound of a dry laugh escaping, though there was no warmth in it. "Hope you meant what you said. Take care of your own, and stay out of what's not yours." Caleb didn't answer, didn't look back. He walked, each step rigid, the weight between his shoulders taut as if Victor's stare were a knife point pressed against him. Anger burned inside, fierce and hot, but he packed it down tight, like a grenade with the pin still in. That fire would have to wait. Behind him, the woods groaned in the wind, carrying the faint tang of cigarette smoke. Victor stayed leaning at the truck, calm, slow in his movements. He slipped a hand into his pocket, drew out an old cell phone, and raised it to his ear. His voice dropped low, each word sliding out heavy, like stones sinking into the hush of the forest. Night fell faster than Caleb expected. Darkness didn't creep in, it poured, filling every crack in the wooden walls, pressing against the windows until the whole house felt swallowed. Inside, the fire in the stove had burned down low, leaving only a faint red glow licking across the grain of old timber. Caleb sat back in the chair, listening hard to every sound the night laid down. On the sofa, Emily had drifted into a shallow sleep, her small face still carved with exhaustion, her hands locked on the blanket like it was the last wall between her and the shadows outside. Caleb kept his eyes on her, and something heavy swelled inside him, a vow he couldn't put into words. He would not let anyone touch this child. The stillness broke with a dog barking somewhere far off. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel, slow at first, then gone. Caleb shot upright, every muscle tightening. He moved quick to snuff the light, and with one finger pressed to his lips, signaled Emily to stay quiet. But her eyes were already open, wide, locked with fear. A sweep of light cut across the front window, sliding like searching eyes. Caleb pulled her close, holding her against his chest, his heart hammering but his breath measured and calm. He knew if they gave themselves away now, the men outside would push in without hesitation. Boots scuffed over gravel, more than one pair. They circled the house, voices low and ragged, drifting in and out of the wind. Caleb pressed Emily against him tighter, listening. They didn't knock, didn't call out. They stood out there like predators testing the fence around their prey. He didn't need to see their faces. He knew Victor had come. There was no time left to think. Caleb bent down, tightened his laces, slung his pack over his shoulders, then pulled Emily up onto his back, her small arms hooked tight around his neck. She was shaking, her quick breaths brushing the back of his neck, but she didn't cry. That silence of hers was strength enough. Caleb gave her one last signal for quiet, then eased the back door open. The door clicked shut behind them, just as beams of light flooded through the front, slashing across the living room where they'd been seconds earlier. Caleb ducked low, then broke into a run for the woods. Behind him, the footsteps quickened. A sharp voice barked out. Flashlights sliced across the yard, skimming the tree line. Caleb carried Emily higher on his shoulders, his stride pounding the ground, fast but steady, his breath held tight to a soldier's rhythm. The trees swallowed them whole. Behind, the chase erupted, boots hammering the leaves, branches cracking, lights darting like white eyes in the dark. Emily pressed her face into his back, her small hands gripping the fabric of his coat until she nearly disappeared into him. Caleb pushed harder, his lungs dragging, but he didn't stop. The forest floor fought him with every step. Roots rose out of the earth like snares. He leapt and swerved, but each stride grew heavier. Sweat slicked his back, soaking his shirt, mixing with Emily's ragged breath. Behind him, the noise grew louder, the weight of men crashing closer, flashlights banging into branches, curses carrying through the trees. They were closing in. Caleb risked a glance over his shoulder. A cone of light burst through the dark, flickering between trunks like eyes, catching him in the act. Too close. He clenched his jaw, veered sharp, and tore toward the path that dipped downhill. He knew this land better than they did. That slope was the only chance he had to open a gap. The ground pitched steep and slick. Caleb bent forward, shifting Emily tighter against his spine, his legs pounding. His heartbeat roared in his chest, blending with the wind screaming past his ears. Branches whipped across his face, the taste of wet leaves, earth, and sweat filling his mouth until it made him dizzy. But he drove on. A lifetime of soldiering had taught him one truth. His own body could take the bullets, but the life on his back, that was something he could not afford to lose. Shouts ripped out behind him, voices raw with frustration, boots drumming faster. A flashlight beam sliced past his head, bright enough to blind, then snapped away. Caleb hurdled a fallen tree, his chest hammering, his balance hanging by a thread. Emily curled closer into his shoulder, a small whimper slipping from her, but she stayed silent. Now his breathing came rough and guttural, each inhale like fire. Still he couldn't stop. The slope opened in front of him, long and dark, thick with leaves. There was no time to weigh the risk. He threw himself down it, his boots slipping the moment they hit. The earth turned slick, and suddenly he was sliding, Emily clutching at his neck, her small hands trembling. Stones rolled and cracked under his heels as he fought to keep his footing. Behind, the beams of light tore down after him, chasing, covering him in a circle of white that clung to his back like a hand, trying to drag him down. Caleb gritted his teeth, leaned forward, and let the hill carry him, every sense screaming that this run wasn't escape, it was survival stretched to its edge. Caleb's body skidded down the slope, leaves and dirt exploding under him, stones cutting into his arms and back like 1,000 hot needles. He wrapped Emily tight against his chest, every inch of him turned into a shield. His ribs screamed, his breath snagged short, but his arms locked hard, refusing to let her slip away. When the tumble ended at the base, he managed to twist sideways, taking the impact himself and sparing her from smashing into a tree trunk. He lay there, lungs burning, head buzzing, his limbs raw with scrapes, his back on fire. But when he looked down, Emily was still in his hold, her eyes wide with fear, but alive. He sucked in a deep breath, the smell of wet earth filling his chest, then pulled himself up and steadied her on her feet. Above, flashlights cut erratic beams through the canopy. Voices barked short and harsh, boots grinding through the leaves. They weren't giving up, not losing track. Caleb clenched his jaw, lifted Emily onto his back again, and moved deeper into the dark. The soldier in him switched over to survival mode. Don't breathe loud. Don't run wild. Find your line. Use the shadows. He remembered half a mile ahead, there was an old woodcutter's shack. Years ago on a hunt, he'd seen it standing lonely and broken in the trees. Right now it was the only shelter he could gamble on. Every step tore through his body. Muscles screamed, scrapes stung, blood stuck to his shirt. But his stride stayed measured, his breath steady. Emily clung to his shoulders, her small hands ice cold against his skin. He pushed through brush with one arm, branches lashing his face, leaving hot marks across him. He didn't falter. Moonlight barely reached here, just thin silver threads. Sweat and blood mixed on his back, but he refused to stumble. He could not go down. Finally, in a thinning of trees, the shack rose out of the dark. It was wrecked roof caved at one corner, walls pocked with holes, the door hanging loose on rusted hinges. But to Caleb, it was a fortress. He lunged to it, shoved the door open with a long creak, slipped inside, and set Emily in the far corner. He dragged the door shut and braced it with a timber. The air inside hit him thick mold, rot, years of abandonment. His lungs tightened, but it was a roof, a barrier between them and the men outside. He sagged against the floorboards, letting his breath slow. His shirt hung torn, skin raw, sweat streaming down his face. He checked his arms, his ribs, his knees hurt but nothing broken. Then his eyes turned to Emily. She sat bundled in the shadows, eyes wet but locked on him, waiting. Caleb reached out, laid a rough hand on her shoulder, pressed once, steady. It was the only promise he could give. For now, they were safe. The shack was a hollow shell, boards gapped wide enough for slivers of light to sneak through. Caleb crouched by a wall, pressed his ear to the wood. Out in the trees, the hunt hadn't quit. Boots still crunched, beams still swept. He closed his eyes and focused on the rhythm. They were spreading out, searching, not yet closing in. He slowed his breathing, let his body sag heavy, turned calm into a weapon. Time crawled. In the dark, his mind reached back to ambush nights overseas, where a cough or the snap of a twig meant blood. The memories pressed in, but he shoved them off, kept his focus here. He pulled Emily closer, sat her at his side, his hand brushing over her hair. He kept his heartbeat slow and steady, let her feel it through his palm, let her know she wasn't alone. Outside, the wind shifted. Leaves scraped against each other, voices murmured, then boots drew closer again. Caleb bent low, peered through a crack in the wall. White light swept across, slicing the dark like a blade. His breath caught, his shoulders stiff, his hand closing around the folding knife in his pocket. Emily clutched his wrist, eyes shut, body shaking. The flashlight beam slid wide, then turned, then cut hard straight across the gap, right onto the spot where the two of them crouched in the corner. The morning sun stretched itself thin over the town, laying a sheet of pale silk light across the row of sagging porches. Caleb's pickup rolled slow down the main street, its tires humming over the faded asphalt, the engine low and tired, blending into the half-asleep quiet of the place. On the seat beside him, Emily sat small, folded into herself. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes ringed with dark shadows from a night that had given her no real rest. The oversized coat swallowed her frame, and her hand clutched the corner of the fabric like it was instinct, like some part of her body refused to let go of whatever protection it could find. Caleb kept his eyes ahead, the wheels steady in his grip. He didn't speak. Inside, something in him had gone cold, but another part was heating fast, simmering hard enough he felt it in his chest. Last night, the fear, the flight through the trees, the beams of flashlight slicing through the dark, none of it had left his head. Each time he thought of those footsteps closing in, of Emily's fingers digging into the collar of his jacket, of her wide, terrified eyes, he felt a line pulling tight across his back. The more he replayed it, the more he knew. If he let this pass, if he let the silence of this town cover it up, then whatever had taken root out there would only keep on growing. The sheriff's office sat beside the old courthouse, a two-story brick building the color of dried blood. The years had dulled its shine, dust clung to the windows, and the curtains inside hung uneven, like no one bothered to straighten them anymore. Caleb pushed the wooden door open. The small brass bell above it gave a weak ring. like it wasn't sure whether to raise an alarm or stay quiet. The smell inside was plain but heavy old paper, stale coffee, the faint hum of a ceiling fan turning slow with its steady rhythm. Behind a broad wooden desk sat Sheriff Dean Holloway. He wore a white shirt buttoned all the way up, the sleeves tight against his thick arms, his frame heavier than it had been back in the days when he wore his uniform every morning. His head lifted when Caleb came in. Recognition flickered in his eyes, then surprise, then the calm mask of a man used to keeping the same face no matter what walked through his door. "Caleb Morgan," he said, his voice slow, deep, the kind of sound a door makes when it closes soft but final. "Heard you were back." Caleb gave a short nod. "I need to talk. Privately." Dean motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit." But Caleb didn't sit. He stood, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, his eyes fixed on Dean's. "Last night," Caleb began, his voice low, heavy, like nails driven into wood. "Someone was circling my house, flashlights in the dark. I had to carry a child through the forest. I heard engines, boots, men who didn't want to be seen." Dean raised an eyebrow. "You see any faces?" "No, but I heard enough, and they knew exactly where to find me." Caleb paused, then pressed on. "I found beer cans, more than one. Footprints, not just mine, and a wooden box, carved with the letters VC. 4. The sheriff didn't speak right away. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced together. "Victor Clay." Caleb nodded once. Dean let out a breath, quiet. "That patch of forest is legally under Clay's use. His hunting camp's got paperwork in order. He runs groups out there during season. They've got shacks. They leave things behind. Beer cans, boxes, it happens. And you think this girl wandered into the woods for no reason? That what I saw, what I'm telling you, is all just coincidence?" Dean's gaze slid to Emily. She sat quiet, her hand clamped onto Caleb's sleeve, her eyes wide and shining, but she didn't make a sound. "What's her name?" Dean asked. Caleb looked at her. Emily's lips moved, but no words came. Instead, she reached inside the coat and pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper, edges worn, lines faded. She handed it to him. Caleb unfolded it, and there, in smudged pencil, were 3 words: Barn 12. Dean took the slip, read it slow, then set it back down on the desk, his elbows pressed against the wood, his hands clenched tight together. "Caleb," he said, his voice even but weighted, "I understand, I truly do, but I need more than feelings. I can't send men into Clay's property on a hunch. Folks around here, they don't bend easy. Clay's respected. At least, that's what the town believes." "Seco." A hollow space opened in Caleb's chest. "I'm not asking you to drag anyone off in cuffs. I just want to know what's inside that barn." Dean shook his head. "To search, I need a warrant. For a warrant, I need evidence." Caleb's fists clenched, knuckles hard against the desk. "I've risked my life to protect people before. Now I don't have a rifle, don't have a squad. But I'll be damned if I walk away while a child shakes with fear under my roof." Dean didn't answer right away. He just held Caleb's eyes, long and steady. Then his shoulders dropped, and he let out a breath, slow and heavy. "I know what kind of man you are, but the law is the law." The words landed like a final stone dropped into deep water. Caleb straightened, pulled his coat tighter, and gave one small nod. "Thanks for nothing." Dean's mouth opened, then closed. No reply came. Caleb turned, his hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her out. The door swung shut behind them, no voice calling them back, no footsteps following. Outside, the daylight spilled across Caleb's jacket, bright and indifferent, while inside his chest, the silence pressed cold and sharp, heavier than any night he'd faced in the woods. The dirt road stretched out toward the northern edge of the forest, like a thin line of smoke, swallowed on both sides by tall oaks that had stood longer than most men in town could remember. Caleb kept the truck moving slow, both hands firm on the wheel, his eyes locked on the way ahead, as though he was willing the picture in his mind to take shape out of the trees. Beside him, Emily sat bundled in the passenger seat, still wrapped in the old blanket she'd carried like skin. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes heavy with shadows, but she didn't ask where they were going. Each time the truck jolted through a rut in the road, her fingers clamped harder into the fabric, the kind of reflex you see in someone who's lived too long in fear. Barn 12. That scrawled note had cut open a new path. You wouldn't find it on any map of the town, but Caleb's memory worked in layers. He remembered the survey books his mother had made him fetch as a boy, helping her keep up with the tangle of land deeds. He remembered those barns, thrown up in the 1,940 seconds to haul lumber out of these hills. Most had collapsed or been stripped for parts decades ago, but a few still stood, sunk deep in the timber where no main road touched. If someone wanted to hide things, wanted to keep business far from eyes, this was where you'd do it. He steered off the main road, wheels crunching through a stretch of weeds grown high as a man's waist. After 100 yards he cut the engine. The rest they'd cover on foot. The silence that fell was heavy, broken only by the hiss of wind sliding through branches overhead. Caleb shouldered his pack. Emily slipped out beside him without a word. The silence clung to her like armor now, not weakness, like the only way she knew to keep from breaking into pieces was to say nothing at all. Barn 12 revealed itself at a bend in the trail, looming and broken. The wooden siding, once painted a bright, proud red, had peeled to grey in sheets. The tin roof sagged like an old man's back. One door hung twisted off its hinge. It wasn't a building so much as the husk of one, a shell of history that had long ago been left to rot. But Caleb's eyes didn't see just age. He'd learned enough overseas to know that what looks abandoned often shelters more than it shows. He crouched behind a wide oak and signaled Emily to stay. Her small head bobbed once, eyes wide but steady. Caleb moved forward alone. Steps pressed soft into the damp earth, each crunch of soil loud in his own ears. He put a hand on the door. Not locked. He pushed. The hinges gave a long, metallic groan, the kind of sound that carried years in it. Dust bloomed at once, hanging in the air like a thin fog, lit by sunlight slanting through gaps in the roof. But it wasn't the sight that stopped him cold. It was the smell, not the dry wood of an old barn. This was damp cloth, sweat soaked into shoes never dried, bodies that had slept too close together. It was the smell of people. Caleb stepped inside. Every footfall stirred dust into the beams of light. His eyes swept the floor. Scraps of cloth, short lengths of rope, a child's sandal with a broken strap. In the far corner lay a thin mattress, mud smeared across it, and on top, a child's sweater, tiny and blue, still damp. He dropped to his knees and lifted it with both hands. The cloth was cold but not old. Someone had been here not long ago. On the wall behind the mattress, a plank had been pried away, revealing a hollow space. Inside were plastic bags, half-empty cans of formula, a box of crackers and a notebook. Caleb pulled it free, thumbed through the warped pages. Ink bled from the damp, but the words still showed dates, hours, numbers, and at the bottom, one line sharp and fresh. Moved last night, one remains. Check 9 p.m. His fingers pressed into the cover, holding it tight. This wasn't shelter. This was a way station, a point in a chain. Caleb stood, his jaw set. He waved Emily over. She ran to him across the dirt, her face drained but determined. Her eyes darted to the mattress, then back to him. "This place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" Emily's small hand shook as she pointed to the mattress. Her lips trembled. "That night, I saw my friend lying there." The words cracked something in him. He squeezed her hand, then turned them both toward the door. His first thought was the phone in the truck, to call Holloway, to force the law's hand. They needed to see this with their own eyes, but as he set foot on the threshold, the sound hit him. An engine, close, grinding through the trees. He shoved Emily back, pressing her tight against the wall. The noise grew, then cut, doors opened, boots hit leaves, and then a voice, low but carrying enough to freeze the air. "Told you once, Morgan. You don't listen." Victor Clay. Caleb dragged Emily behind a stack of old crates, pushing her down into the shadows. Through the slit in the doorway he saw them, Victor and 3 others. One carried a crowbar. Another lugged a plastic can, liquid sloshing inside. They walked with purpose, their faces set, their eyes hard. They reached the barn. Caleb's muscles locked. He wrapped his arms around Emily, holding her steady, whispering nothing but silence into her ear. The door slammed shut. The iron bolt clanged into place. Metal rang against wood. Once, twice. Then the boots shuffled away. Stillness fell again. Emily's hand clutched at his sleeve, her breath sharp in his chest. Caleb leaned close to the boards. No voices now. No engines. Only a smell. Thin, at first. Drifting through the cracks. Then, stronger. Smoke. The acrid bite of it curled into his nose, rising fast. Caleb's throat burned. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled Emily tighter, scanning the barn for a way out, knowing with every breath that Victor hadn't come to warn him, he'd come to finish it. And in that smoke, with the child's weight pressed against him, Caleb felt the old soldier rise again, not the man who'd come home for peace, but the one who had clawed through fire before and would do it again. Because Barn 12 wasn't just a place on a map anymore. It was a trap, and now it was burning. The smoke thickened fast. At first it was just the faint smell of wood singeing, like bark tossed on a campfire. But now it clawed at the throat, wet and heavy, like a damp rag set aflame and shoved into his lungs. Caleb dropped low, pressing himself against the floorboards, his cheek near the grit and dust, his eyes shut tight for a heartbeat, just to steady himself. When he opened them again, the look in them was stripped clear. There wasn't time. Emily was coughing behind him, the sound rasping, her small hands clamped to his jacket collar as though cloth could filter the poison out of the air. Her shoulders shook with each breath, and the space inside barn 12, already small and suffocating, seemed to shrink down to a coffin with every wave of smoke that rolled in. He pushed to his feet and lunged toward the eastern wall, the same section he'd noticed had been pried before, the spot he'd sized up in his head as the weakest. He had no hammer, no crowbar, no soldier's kit, just his bare hands and a length of rusted pipe he'd yanked from a pile of junk in the corner. Caleb wrapped his coat around one arm, gripped the pipe, and jammed it into the seam. The wood groaned under the strain, planks flexing but not breaking. His eyes burned, watered until tears cut tracks down through the soot on his face. Sweat soaked his hairline, running into his mouth, briny with dust. But he kept pushing, kept prying, each shove of his body a silent oath that if he got the girl out, nothing about this fight would ever be about running again. Behind him, Emily coughed hard enough that her whole frame shuddered. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just hunched over and clung to a scrap of fabric, holding it over her nose. She seemed to understand in some wordless way that if she stayed quiet, if she held herself steady, Caleb could keep swinging. She wasn't just a victim now. She was fighting too, in the only way a child could by enduring. Finally, one plank gave, then another. A sliver of night air slipped in, cool and sharp. Caleb widened the gap, shoving until the wood cracked apart into a hole barely wide enough. Not a door, just an opening, but it would do. He pulled Emily to him, slipped her through first. Her small hands grabbed dirt and grass, her body wriggling out into the open. Caleb jammed his shoulder against the gap, shoving until the hole spread wider, the wood splintering with a sound like a bone breaking. He forced himself through, the jagged edge ripping into his shoulder. Warm blood spread down his arm, but he didn't slow. He stumbled out into the open air, smoke trailing after him like a curse. He barely had a chance to breathe before the sound cut sharp behind him, metal shrieking as the barn door swung wide. Not fire breaking it down. Men. Boots hit the ground. Voices rang. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Victor's crew." Caleb clamped Emily to his chest and ran. The forest ahead was black and shifting, branches alive with wind and ash blowing out of the barn. There was no clear trail, just instinct, just the old compass inside his ribs pulling him between the trees. He barreled forward, his boots pounding mud, the girl clutched against him. Behind came the pursuit, shouts snapping like whips, boots hammering the dead leaves, the rhythm of hunters who thought they had the kill cornered. They split. Caleb could hear it. One charging straight after him, another breaking wide to cut him off. He veered downhill, away from the truck, away from the obvious escape. He knew better than to run to the predictable. He dropped toward the dry creek bed he'd spotted the night before. Down there were boulders the size of wagons, stones that could buy him seconds. His breath was ragged, chest rattling with smoke. Emily's coughs grew shorter, sharper. He stopped behind one of the boulders, set her down gently on the cold earth. She sagged, hands to her face, tears carving streaks through the ash on her cheeks. Caleb knelt at the creek's edge, soaked a handkerchief, pressed it over her mouth and nose, wiping her face, rubbing her back. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice low and steady, forcing calm into it. "We're still here. We're all right." But he knew this wasn't an ending. This was just a pause. The hunt was still alive behind them, pressing closer. Saving her wasn't just about escaping one burning barn. It was about cutting through the whole circle that had swallowed this town, that had trapped children in shadows and silenced neighbors into complicity. Engines roared in the distance. Lights cut across the tree line, beams swinging. At first, his gut clenched, thinking it was Victor tightening the net. But then the voices came, sharp and commanding, amplified over loudspeakers. "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapons, hands in the air." Caleb almost fell where he stood. Relief swept through him so fierce it felt like weakness, but he didn't cry, didn't let his shoulders drop. Instead, he pressed his forehead to Emily's, let her feel the warmth of his skin, the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "We made it to morning," he whispered. "You see? We got to see the sun again." He pulled her back onto his chest and carried her uphill, feet driving harder now. At the forest edge, The scene opened. Victor and his men were cornered by the harsh glare of headlights, deputies shouting them down with weapons leveled. One of Victor's men bolted, scattering into the trees. The others froze. Victor himself stood rooted, his arms lifted half high, his eyes cold and fixed on Caleb like stone, unmoving even with the shotguns trained on him. Sheriff Dean Holloway stepped from the lead cruiser, his shotgun cradled like a relic of law itself. His eyes locked on Caleb, blood running down his arm, his clothes black with soot, Emily clutching at his back. The old lawman lowered the barrel, crossed the space fast, and reached out a hand. Caleb passed Emily into his arms. "You're late," Caleb rasped. His throat was raw from smoke, but the words cut clear. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I came late," he said quietly, "but I came." No. Emily was carried to the medical van, hands of paramedics already on her, lights flickering across her skin as they checked her pulse, her lungs, her cuts. She didn't speak. She sat quiet, letting them prod and rap, her eyes fixed only on Caleb. He started to turn away, the weight of the night pressing him down. But her hand shot out, small fingers grabbing at the sleeve of his torn jacket, holding fast. "What is it?" Caleb asked, crouching low. His face close to hers, his voice steady, worn but alive. Emily lifted her head. And for the first time since he'd found her in the woods, her eyes weren't only wide with fear. They carried something else now. A plea. A call that reached deeper than survival. Her voice cracked, soft as breath, but the words were steady. "My friend is still out there." Morning came slow. Not the kind of sudden blaze you see in movies, but the real kind, the sort that leaks in gently, testing the edges of the world, slipping through leaves and damp walls like even the sun isn't sure it's safe to show up yet. The forest carried less of the smoke smell now. The wind had shifted, dragging in the green scent of wet grass, the clean musk of earth after rain, though there was still a faint trace of ash clinging like a shadow from the night before. Caleb sat on a wooden bench out front of the small field clinic. His left arm was bound in layers of white gauze that had already picked up a tint of dirt and sweat. He didn't grimace. He didn't let on that it hurt. Pain had long since turned into background noise for him, like wind running through trees, always there, never gone, but not something worth giving your attention to. Through the frosted glass inside, he could see Emily. She was sitting with a woman whose hair fell loose and brown around a tired face. Her eyes were deep, rimmed in red, but steady. Mother and daughter sat close, their hands stacked on each other like one pulse, trying to remember the rhythm of another. No words carried through the glass. They didn't need them. Caleb didn't move to interrupt. He knew better. This was a kind of reunion where his place was outside, letting it happen without him. He'd done his part, he'd brought the girl out alive, and now she needed to step back into the world that had been stolen from her, or at least what pieces of it could still be put back together. The door creaked open. Emily came out first. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She walked on her own 2 feet, the same feet that had once stumbled, terrified in the dark, and she walked them steady now. Her eyes found him. She kept them there as she crossed the small stretch of ground. Caleb didn't say a word. He just opened his arms. Emily didn't cry, but she folded herself into him, holding tight, clutching like she was gripping the storm itself and wouldn't let it take her again. Her mother followed after, her voice thin but steady, her eyes swollen from tears. "Thank you," she said. That was all. No speeches, no unraveling of what couldn't be unraveled. Just those 2 words, and Caleb nodded. Sometimes the only answer you can give is a quiet, "I understand," even if you don't say it out loud. By midday, Sheriff Dean Holloway showed up. He carried a thin stack of folders, though the weight of them bent his shoulders more than the paper inside. "We found some things," he said, voice worn. Victor Clay admitted to parts of it during first questioning. He handed Caleb a bag with photos, a notebook, and a rough map they'd pulled from Barn 12. Caleb didn't tear into it right away. He just sat there on the bench, his gaze fixed on the tree line in the distance. "What about the others?" he asked. The sheriff stayed silent for a beat. His face worked around the truth like it was gravel in his teeth. "Not sure," he said finally. "We're widening the search, but," he hesitated. "Emily mentioned another friend." Caleb nodded. "I know." By late afternoon, a pair of vans rolled in, white and clean, the kind you see tied to government offices. Caseworkers got out, their ID badges swinging, their voices polite, measured, like they'd been trained to step gently into places already broken. Emily and her mother were scheduled to move to a safer place somewhere with counselors, with locks that worked, with time to patch holes words couldn't reach. Caleb stood near the van as they loaded in, He didn't say anything when they stepped inside, but just before the door slid shut, Emily turned back. She didn't wave. She didn't say goodbye. She lifted her small hand, curled her forefinger into a circle, the little sign the two of them had made in the woods when silence was the only shield they had. Caleb gave her a single nod. It wasn't just farewell. It was a promise, one that said, "This isn't the end. I'll keep going." The van pulled away, its tires spitting gravel, the sound carrying on the wind. Leaves scattered across the road in its wake. That night, Caleb went back to the old cabin that had once belonged to his mother. The place smelled the same as it always had: damp wood, lamp oil, the faint, stale dust of time. On the wall hung a black and white photo of his father, the same photo that had stared down every time Caleb came home on leave without warning. He lit a fire in the stove, not because he needed heat, but because the pop and crackle of wood had always carried him closer to memory than words ever could. He settled into the rocking chair, eyes on the flames, and for the first time in years he gave himself permission to think about nothing, not about the next move, not about the plan, not about who might still be out there. He just breathed. By morning, the town was buzzing the way towns do quietly, in murmurs at the diner counters, in lowered voices on porches, rumors drifting like ink through warm water. Some said a fire had burned out in the forest. Others said there'd been arrests. But everyone knew the name Victor Clay. You couldn't hide that part. You couldn't pretend not to notice when a man like him was dragged out in cuffs, right from the land he'd claimed as his own. The people who'd once written Caleb off as the soldier who'd lost his way after the war avoided his eyes now when they passed him on Main Street. Some gave him short nods. A few muttered greetings. Small things, but real. Caleb didn't need more. He went to the market in the mornings, picking up just enough to get by: bread, coffee, nails, strips of wood, things to patch the porch his mother had always said she'd fix one day. In the afternoons, he walked the edge of the forest. Not deep, just far enough to remember the lay of the land, to let his eyes and ears get used to the noises that once had set every nerve on edge. Now the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the hush of the canopy no longer made him flinch. They sounded like echoes, like listening to an old song you knew where the sad parts came, where the notes climbed, where the silence would fall. A week passed before Holloway showed up again. He wasn't in uniform this time, just jeans, a wrinkled shirt, his beard a day too long. He looked tired, the way men look when sleep is short and worry is long. "I've got news," he said, digging a folded note from his pocket. "We found another child's footprint, about 3 miles from barn 12. Might have been Emily's friend." Caleb unfolded the paper, read slow. No name, just description. But it was enough to sink something sharp into his chest again. "I'm going with you," Caleb said. The sheriff didn't nod, didn't argue. He just stood there, silent, and that was agreement enough. The next day, Caleb went back to barn 12. No smoke now, no locks on the doors, just the same creak from the hinge, the same smell of rot and soot clinging to the boards. He stepped inside, into the emptiness, and stood there in the same spot where Emily had once curled up against the wall. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, striping the floor with pale beams. He closed his eyes. The images came back raw, like water dumped cold across his neck. The sound of his own lungs scraping for air, the pounding of boots chasing, the sting of smoke cutting him down to size, the grip of a small hand refusing to let go. But in the middle of that storm of memory was something else, soft, delicate, thin as a kite string: trust. When he opened his eyes again, nothing had changed. But he had, because this time, he wasn't standing there alone. He walked the trail out, his boots pressing firm into the soft ground. Rain from the night before had left the earth wet, footprints pressed into the surface. Some were blurred, washed at the edges. But one stood out, a small shoe print, angled, like a child had stumbled through. Not clear, not perfect, but not gone either. Caleb froze, stared deep into the woods. The forest answered with silence, and then, from far off, not near barn 12, not near any road or path he knew, came a cry. Not loud, not long, but sharp enough to straighten his back, to open his eyes wide, to set his heart hammering in the old rhythm again, the rhythm of a man who knew, without question, that the work wasn't finished. The journey wasn't over. Some things happen in places nobody pays much attention to, but they leave an echo that lingers for years in those who pass through. This story reminds us that you don't have to understand everything to do what's right. Sometimes it just takes one person steady enough, quiet enough not to abandon someone halfway, and that's enough. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. Some journeys don't end with applause or noise, they end with a single choice, one person deciding not to leave another behind. And sometimes, that's enough. If you've ever witnessed an act of kindness like that, even something small, share it in the comments. Your story might be the reason someone else finds the strength to keep going. We'll see you again in the next story, where we remind ourselves that coming home isn't about forgetting, it's about healing.